So we're on the fifth yama, or the fifth precept, which is Aparigraha, which usually gets translated as non-greed. I often translate it as either non-acquisitiveness or just generosity and non-possessiveness. One of the things that's been interesting translating these terms is whether you take the negative side, the more literal side, like non-greed, or you flip it and you take the positive side and you really look at generosity. So the thing I liked about translating it as non-possessiveness is it seems to land between both, because there's something powerful about looking at your life, at your inner world, and also your attachments in the outer world in terms of not being possessive. So I thought we could just start with this term, non-possessiveness. And the reason why I wanted to interview you in particular is because you have a yoga practice, a long-time Buddhist practice, and also you're a psychotherapist and a friend. And so I just thought, and you're one of the smartest people I know. So I thought it might be nice to just kind of look at this particular precept from a more psychological perspective than some of the other precepts we've looked at. So maybe we could start just by seeing what comes up around possessiveness. What you think that means. What does it mean in a psychological sense? What does it look like with people? How could we recognize it?
The first thing that comes to mind when you talk about possessiveness, when I think about what it looks like in people, is grasping and for control. So tightening around any particular situation with the idea that there is a result that can come out of it. And one of the places that I see this in particular is really around anything to do with grief. So, meaning that a person doesn't necessarily look at it as an issue about grief, but that when there is some kind of loss, that grasping and possessiveness and trying to control a situation is a response from it.
Do you mean loss in the sense that they're losing an object or a person? Or do you mean also kind of, there's sometimes a kind of just basic underlying feeling that something's missing?
Right,
too,
yeah.
Like something's been lost.
Yeah, I mean, I think what first was coming to mind was that usually there is some kind of loss or events that happen, and that might be a place where somebody gets particularly sticky or stuck or tight and controlled in their lives. But I also would say that in terms of finding this kind of quality of underlying missingness would contribute to it too. And I think where I see that a lot is just in our relationship to time, and to events, and wanting to see events unfold in a particular way. So it's the something about the fixed attitude around outcomes is what's coming to me.
So if I can act in a certain way now that's controlled, then I could possibly control the outcome. So for example, if I really work on a certain kind of persona, then I could control how people perceive me. And in that way, the possessiveness would be trying to control people's perception of me. And then what would the grief be? What would the loss be? What would I be covering up?
Well, I mean, a grief is really that we're not in charge.
Right.
And that we've had the experience over and over again of things slipping through our fingers. Either, the acknowledgement that we should have had, the comfort and connection we ought to have had, like all the things that we imagine through our story of ourselves and also through watching others that we ought to have received or we ought to have experienced. So as those slip away, as those experiences don't end up panning out, then we have a grief and we have a lack, which we would move to cover up.
One of the things I think about when you say that is just, it's interesting in the yoga and Buddhist traditions how much focus there is on impermanence. How, like, if we really want to look at finding some ground, we really need to embrace impermanence. And it seems like possessiveness is kind of like the enemy of impermanence. Like, yeah, or it's some kind of a response to impermanence that makes us feel like it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah, I mean, for some, the main thing that's coming up for me is actually I'm thinking about the bodies of tightening, and of you know, just trying to create a life that's within a particular kind of track, and that when you're living in that particular way, everything is a threat to, you know, to your kind of particular way of holding yourself and holding towards a particular outcome. So there's a lot of pain, which I think then just further perpetuates, and this is the kind of samsaric story, which perpetuates the need to hold on. Because then when I am holding so tightly, and then I have the experience that it's not working, I hold tighter instead of what it means to let go, you know, and to have looser. And I think that you know, I guess one of the ways that this comes up for me a lot, and when I think about it in yoga, is that I do think people need to have the experience of being held, and of being able to have space. You know, just like we talk about with breathing. You know, when we tighten, we shorten our breath, and when we shorten our breath, we get more rigid in our structure, and we're more easy to topple. You know, so just in kind of like expanding that base, you know, if we had the experience of more breathing room, we could actually move through loss and impermanence, you know, which I think is what the cycle of the breath ultimately is like a constant kind of modulating between you know, something coming forward and becoming exciting, and something that we can relax and release with. So I think that our breath is a perfect example of being with impermanence. And that we fear the bottoming out and the letting go and the what I would call being held. You know, being able to exhale is, in a sense, being able to be held in the emptying space.
I like that way of thinking about the end of the exhale, not so much as surrender, which sometimes just seems too big, you know, for people, but more a sense of, you know, you're held in something much bigger than what the narrow ego is trying to package.
Yeah, so that something could come through, so that, you know, so that in those moments of perhaps being held or of letting go, there's a freshness that can allow something other than the, you know, the track, the possessiveness.
So it seems like addiction is just one more step in degree in that kind of path of possessiveness. You know, when you talk about tightening up, when you talk about contracting, when you talk about defending against change, defending against impermanence, when you talk about a response to grief or loss, could you talk a little bit about addiction and how it might be related, if it's related to possessiveness? Because it sounds like if you keep going down the road of describing degrees of possessiveness, you get addiction.
Right.
Or obsessiveness. You know.
Yeah, obsessiveness and addiction. Yeah, they're kind of, I think they share some things. I mean, what comes to mind for me is that within addiction that there's a misunderstanding of, well, first there's a misunderstanding of needs.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a misunderstanding of richness, of abundance, of generosity, a kind of confusion around that. And so, one of the things in addiction is that we go for something that looks appealing, but there's no observation of limits. And so rather than understanding and having the experience of satisfaction, which demands digestion of whatever it is we take in, we have the experience of a mini relief, some form of relief that usually has a kind of quickness to it. It's like, whatever bottoming out experience I'm having, what emotion I'm experiencing, or whatever lack I'm experiencing, I then get out of it really quickly in the act of whatever my addiction is to, whether that be the internet or a drug of some kind. And so, one of the things is that it tends to work in the beginning, right? So, like, it does tend to give some amount of relief from, we could say, this perpetual impermanence that we're experiencing. But more and more, it really just feeds that gap, that emptiness. Maybe not the best word to use, but longing, and so I think people can't actually taste their experience, can't actually absorb whatever it is that they're taking in, and so it's like, I mean, when you consider overeating,
eating the food, not tasting it. Eating the food, not knowing your limits. Or the opposite, I guess, is true too, right? Is controlling how much you eat. So not kind of excessive eating, but the opposite also.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Like not eating enough also is a kind of possessiveness too.
Yes, yeah. And again, I think there's something, I mean, we might see more of the aggressiveness there, where on the other side we tend to focus on the giving in. Right? So one is kind of more that I give in, and the other seems to be more I withhold. But in both, there's a confusion about appetite, a confusion about need.
Yeah.
And so, there's something that's being overridden, which is a limit, because obviously there has to be some kind of feedback. In ourselves. And when it's not in ourselves, I think where it ends up coming up is in our environment. So in our relationship to others, and in our, basically in resources kind of running out or being scarce in any kind of way. Maybe that's how we find out when we don't have a sensate experience of limits.
There's a child psychologist you might be familiar with, Adam Phillips. And he wrote a paper called Enough is Enough, which is about excess and possessiveness. And I came across this one, I'll just read it to you, and I found really interesting. When young people are being excessive, they are unconsciously, without realizing it, trying to find strong containing parents. Unruly adolescents, for example, can be thought of as needing to find out just how reliable, just how robust and impressive the authorities really are. Children are only as powerful as their parents let them be, and there's nothing the child is more frightened of than being too powerful. So he seems to be saying here that when we're excessive, really deep down in our heart of hearts, or unconsciously, he's saying, really we're trying to find a boundary, we're trying to find a limit, we're trying to find, as you said, something to contain us. That's a really interesting way of thinking about excess, as actually really wanting or craving a limit that for some reason hasn't been internalized or isn't in your own structure.
Right. Yeah. Am I alone here? Am I? What is this world? I mean, when I say "Am I alone here?" on the one hand, it's like, is there anyone responsive to me?
Yeah.
But then also, is there a world there? And what is this world? And how do I come into relationship with it? Yeah, I think it's bringing me back again to the idea of, that we want to be in relationship, and that when there's a feeling of gap or non-responsiveness, perhaps we don't know our boundaries. I mean, when I think about kids, especially when I think about teenagers and like binge drinking, there's that idea of, I need to know what my power is. I need to know what I can do. What's my limit? And just because I heard so and so say that this is what it is, what is actually true.
Somebody came to. There's a new person who's been practicing at Center of Gravity lately. He's so wonderful, and he really broke down at the end of sitting this past week one day, and he said to me, I came to sit because I wanted some peace, and I didn't realize how wounded I was. And I just thought it was so courageous for him to say it and to acknowledge it. He's only known me for 1 month. But this notion that I didn't know how wounded I was. And in a way, so many people are drawn to meditation practice because it promises a kind of transcendence. And yet at the same time, I think a lot of us start meditating and then we realize that what's there are really a lot of old wounds where there are places in us we don't know how to find space in. Like you talked earlier about breathing space. So there are places, as Pema Chodron says, that scare us, and usually they're the places we can't find breathing space. So we respond by contracting, quitting, getting an idea about practice, whether we like it or not. So I was wondering if you could just talk about possessiveness and like what it actually looks like with people. They come to see you as a teacher, they come to see you as a therapist. What do you see? Like, what does it feel like to be in the room? What kind of signs do you, how do you see possessiveness taking place in the moment in your relationship with them?
One of the places that I tend to see this, or the way that I frame it, a lot of times has to do with a person's ability to receive support. A person's ability to receive. That's usually the measure by which I go by, and I don't often think about it. It's like what we were talking about earlier about whether we look at this question from the sort of from the negative or from the positive. Grasping or generosity. So I tend to see what is somebody's ability to receive support, and by that a lot of times what that means is the way a person is working. They're working on the problem. They're working on themselves. They're working in such a way that they maybe desperately want help, but they're not available to receive it. And sometimes that might be because of the desperation. It creates a kind of busyness. And this, in a lot of ways, has to do with how, when we're finding difficulties with ourselves, we may rely heavily on ourselves to figure it out. And in that figuring out, kind of create even more of a...
I can do this alone. I don't need you.
Which in itself is a way of, of staying away from the pain of you may not help me if I ask you. So if I ask you, I have to be open to it not working out. And I think meditation is similar in that way. Is that if we're, again, if we're sort of on the agenda of fixing it, it's too tight for the situation. But there is something of showing up to just feel what is not getting met. And that's the kind of, that's, you know, that's harder to teach, right? That's something that in a sense somebody's, how flexible a person is, or their mind is. How often have they had experiences of losing and it not being a failure?
Yeah, like maybe the last time I asked for help, the person abandoned me, or they failed, or I was always told not to ask for help.
Right.
Or, you know, if I ask for help, I'm not strong. Right? Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. It's interesting because I think the kind of people who are called to meditation practice, it's, you know, one of the things I noticed very much just having spent time in Thailand was that there's no practices that happen independent of very strong community. So some people that, you know, they may practice for years just building or gardening before they're ever introduced to meditation practice. But I notice here meditation is much more solitary. You know, like most people are, you know, I'm going to become a Buddhist practitioner not because I'm interested in community, but because I want to be able to sit facing a wall and really go deep, you know, in solo meditation. And I wonder, though, sometimes all that working hard on oneself can also be a bit of a defense, a resistance against a kind of healing that might need to happen relationally. Which gets back to what you're saying about, you know, I'm working hard on myself, I'm improving myself, but maybe like completely missing this other side.
Yeah.
Of really just also needing just love that comes from another human, or support that can come just from community.
Right.
Belonging.
Yeah. I think that there's a way in which stamina is I think a lot of people take up meditation with a sense of stamina. And you know, and you hear the people who are sort of like, oh, I couldn't hack that, I couldn't take the pain, right? And then others who are like going for it. And I think, you know, it's there has to be some kind of trust in the community or the people around in order to open up to what is being experienced. Because otherwise, and it really is kind of about being in a teaching sort of mode, where, you know, most of our education system is still very much based on having the right answer, you know, and having the right answer in meditation is dangerous, right? Because it doesn't lead us to what is actually going on for us. So I think people have a tendency to suffer alone, rather than reaching out where it's important. I mean, we see acquisitiveness in learning and techniques, right? But I think it's more on the in the realm of actually being able to take in, to be able to take in, you know, something, and to really say, I've got to know it myself, is really different than this kind of like, I'm acquiring more information, I'm becoming more studious, I'm getting a grasp of things, you know, as a way to be right and to know how to get through this. So, you know, that kind of, it's sort of like the whole process of people coming into yoga and wanting to fix their bodies, right? And so we see in meditation a kind of attitude of, you know, stamina with the mind. And the flexibility, this, you know, as you're talking about community or the compassion part, probably does need to have relationship. In order to understand that.
Yeah, otherwise the idea of generosity is a little idealistic or philosophical. How do I give? It also includes how can I be given to? How can I also appreciate when someone's offering me something? You know.
And this brings up something that I find, really comes up a lot in terms of in psychotherapy, and particularly in psychotherapy groups, is that people often really do want to be generous and towards others. And sometimes, we could say that that's the experience of I want to be liked. But there's also a sort of genuine impetus towards wanting to make others comfortable, like we would want to be made comfortable.
Right. Yeah.
And one of the places that I find that, for a sort of important setting of ground in a therapy group is about the limits of that, understanding where I'm going beyond and, taking care of others, as opposed to understanding what it is they need and what it is I need. So it kind of brings up the thing around limits, because it is through our caring of other people that we can learn to care for ourselves. But having a clear understanding of what is helpful and what is really just getting out of something that I find unease with.
Yeah, it's interesting, on retreats, on the first day, we have a list of rules we go through. And one of them is really to trust in the silence together relationally. So if you see someone who's your roommate who's really crying a lot, don't go up to them if you're one of these kind of people and just start hugging them and asking them what's wrong. Like, trust in the silence and the practice enough that they need to go through what they need to go through, especially if you're really feeling from them that they want you to come hug them. And let the teacher or some of the other leaders on the retreat take care of working with that student. And for a lot of people, especially Jews and Italians, they really have a hard time seeing somebody go through something without quickly going and wanting to hug them or make them tea or a meal. And it can be a really powerful healing process for people whose tendency is to be a caregiver, to see the limits of caregiving, like where they don't know how to give somebody space. That's a really powerful teaching for people.
Yeah, and I think when you bring up the kind of cultural, the cultural rules on top of the personal, so the cultural norms that say this is how I pay respect, this is how I, tend to others, and these sorts of things are so strong that they are definitely things that can get in our way. Yeah,
they need food,
right?
Or they wouldn't be crying so much,
right? Yeah, and it's I think that boundaries are something that ultimately help people to sort out what is possessiveness and what is it to care for myself. What is it that I actually need support on? I think that's, at least my experience in practice, is that it's easy to see meditation practice, yoga practice forms and the boundaries, even within psychotherapy, a lot of boundaries, to see those boundaries as being another rite, another culture, another set of rules. Yeah. And in that way, we can just apply what was and I'm always going to be a good boy, I'm always going to be a good girl, and I'm always going to try and fit by those rules. But it's different to have them in the place of a practice, right, where those boundaries are there to be able, I think it's to support somebody to be able to digest. Yes. What is my experience? What is it that I need, and where are my limits? Yeah. Do I really, so that I can be genuine. There's plenty of times where I'm genuinely drawn into somebody else's problem. And that has to do with my problem, right? I'm suffering as much as they are. And there's other times when that's not the case. And I may feel pressured from the cultural norm to act in a particular way. And it takes a lot of guts to not do that. Yeah. So I think the forms in that way support people to just observe these tendencies, and to get clearer about what's authentic, what's genuine.
Yeah, in this course we've talked about how each precept has 3 levels. The literal level, so an example of that is don't kill. And then the compassionate level, which is how do you actually express the precept in your life? There are times where you need to kill, and that's still upholding the precept. And then there's the koan level, or the mysterious level, which is when you really look at a precept like generosity. It just opens you up to this moment and what's actually going on in this moment. It has nothing to do with rules and vows. But actually it also has everything to do with rules and vows, or you wouldn't see it that way. So how do you move between these different levels, the literal level, the compassionate level, and then the mystery level? So one thing I really wanted to ask you that I think about a lot is, many people say, what's the difference between Western psychology and yoga, or Western psychology and Buddhism? And to me, in this course, this precepts course, one thing that's kind of emerging for me is how in Western psychology we don't really talk about ethics other than professional ethics. Like, there's no room in our work with clients to ask them about how greed is showing up in their life, or nonviolence, or there's not really like a scaffolding or a form that we can use to check in with our clients about ethical principles.
It's interesting because I think that where that comes up is kind of more in the symptom, in what's presenting. So when a person comes in to psychotherapy, they usually have some kind of problem that they're presenting. And especially nowadays, there's kind of this sense that therapies should address the problem. And I think in a similar way, we now think that meditation should address the problem, right? But ultimately, then there's the considerations. What kind of world, what kind of mind is this person living in, and what kinds of things are they experiencing that such a problem arises, right? So I don't know, I think one of the things is that as a therapist, as somebody, looking at the problem that is being presented, I think that's where we can look to ethics and see inquire as to what is going unchecked.
How can you describe?
I mean, one example that's coming to mind is it comes from addiction model and the stages of change. So the stages of change being one, theoretical model for how somebody moves through addiction towards, basically being in a more healthy, balanced situation. So when somebody's like very, very early stages, it's often referred to as pre-contemplation. So at that point, I'm really not thinking that I have so much of a problem. I'm just doing what I'm doing. The next stage, contemplation, one of the ways that that's addressed is really looking at the consequences of actions.
Right.
Examining the consequences of actions. And this is the therapeutic treatment for a pre-contemplation stage, is bringing to somebody's awareness what, if any, consequences are there in your family, in your environment, in your future, towards your dreams, with all of these kinds of things. So I think that kind of outlook is already looking at something toward ethics, but without imposing a particular idea.
So without the literal level, in a way.
Yeah. And, I think that this is very important because, therapies need to be responsive to individuals' ideas of health. Because if psychology is imposing the idea of health on the individual, then we have a lot of problems, right? Because
health is getting back to work, right?
What do you mean by that?
Going back to your job on Monday,
right?
I mean that's kind of like you see in some schools of psychology. They have an idea of what mental health is, and it's the person's ability to be working. And then that kind of limits what's possible in the relationship, because the person may not even have the time with the therapist to unpack what's going on, because the model for both of them is we're here because we're trying to get me working again.
Yeah, and ultimately I think it's also about power between the therapist and the client, is that if I have an ethical kind of standards by which I am treating you, then it's really that I have a certain one-up on you.
Yeah.
So,
I know what's right.
Yeah, and that's where I see the danger. So I think that's one of the reasons why, I think that all therapists have a sense of their own ethics, and I think that's actually one of the places where it's very important. For me as a therapist, I'm always using myself as a gauge for what is happening with the client. And that's one of the ways in which I can see, what do I sense is off here, is often going to be something from my own ethical standards.
Yeah.
And if I haven't looked into something myself, chances are I'm not going to be able to help spot it or
And
even
someone
feel
else.
it in them.
Do you ever have the feeling when you're working with somebody who comes in and is really contracted around an idea that you actually take on their body, where you feel the intensity of their situation in your own body, where your body becomes like an instrument, like a tool, that you can kind of gauge what's going on for them just by what's happening in your own.
Well, yeah. As in my particular therapy practice, I often, because I work a lot of the times I work somatically, so I taking on that person's body gives lots of information for what is being experienced, and that's actually one of the ways that I work through what's happening with the client. Either what am I doing, how am I responding, am I pulling back, am I pushing forward, and what is that experience to hold myself like that, so that I can tune into what that might feel like
For them. Yeah.
Because what this feels like is very different than what it sends out to you.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that it's certainly very useful to know that that's happening.
Yeah.
And there are times when it's really, I really need to, leave whatever it is I'm experiencing behind. And often I find lying on the floor is the best remedy for that.
To drop their body out of your body, you mean?
Yeah.
Because you've taken something on.
Taken something on, and any form of shavasana seems to be the perfect remedy in a sense, because that's where I can come back to the feeling of contact with the floor and of gravity, and in a sense reconnect with what is going through me now, as opposed to kind of holding on to something, a patterning that I've witnessed. But we're ultimately, we are impacting each other, right? We're impacting each other, and we are picking up what's around us. And I think in the same way, it's really important to know that we are putting our way of being into the room, wherever we are, and that so much of what we're experiencing and feeling is something that is from what's going on around us, and not something that's just our own creation.
Yeah. We're picking it up from the culture, from our environment,
We're being a sieve for something that's going on. We're acting as some kind of filter for the situation, and to see that that's the case is, I think, one of the things that meditation practice and yoga practice can really help us to clarify. both meditation and yoga, I think, it really about coming back to our sensate bodily experience is one of the places where we can start to see where we're clinging and where we're overdoing. And begin to actually feel what a limitation, like what a limit or a boundary is.
Yeah. I guess the last thing I wanted to ask you, maybe it's even just a statement, and then I would just be interested in your response, which is just that we're living in a time where our society and the economic system that we live in is really rooted in greed, and I even sometimes see what's happening in the university system as being similar. This kind of like acquisition of knowledge, like another kind of greed where more information. And we don't seem to be producing people who are wiser. We're producing experts and specialists. It seems this has something to do with how much greed we feel is acceptable, So I'm interested as somebody who I think, we share similar politics, but from the perspective of someone who's working every day with people's psychological ills and symptoms in their body, what do you observe and what do you make of this? That the symptoms of our time showing up in people.
The main thing that comes to mind is anxiety. Non-resting. Non-being. Non-beingness, in a sense. The busyness that this greed and this of the society and the culture, the greed seems to create busyness, and the busyness doesn't allow people to really feel or I would say empty out or let go of whatever it is that's just happened. So we're not as resilient, this is the word, we're not as resilient. Because we're so worked up, we're speedy, and we're tight and fearful and anxious. And I think, I think ultimately a greedy society it comes from a poverty mentality, right? It is
scarcity.
It's born from scarcity. And in a scarce world, we're not safe. And when we're not safe, we can't relax, and we can't actually enjoy what's around us. So this is one of the things that I think I see is that we have a lot of resources, sometimes just an inch away from us. But when we're in this tightness and contracted kind of scarce mentality, we're not even curious about what's out there. We're not even looking, because we don't have that. We don't have our back, in a sense. We can't relax and receive.
It's interesting, during the Occupy movement, one of the things that really helped me was Naomi Klein said at one point that the solutions to our economic problems are also going to be the same solutions to our social problems and to our ecological problems. When you were talking about this kind of age of anxiety, it seems that a kind of economic change and a psychological change both need to happen together, in a way. They can't happen without each other.
Right.
In a way. You can't just tell people to relax when everything around them is so driven, you know.
No, I mean, we need to feel it. We need to feel, we don't need to relax.
Yeah.
In that relax.
Yeah.
We don't need to relax. We need to feel what's happening and respond.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that has to do with doing that in relation and in connection. And kind of fessing up to what we're experiencing.
Yeah.
You know, because especially in the past...
It's like atonement or something.
Right. Yeah, but we have a lot
what's
of
really
kind of
going on?
Fake confessing in a way. Like, you know, we have this sort of society now where everybody can be depressed and anxious.
Yeah.
But I still don't think that there's a genuine curiosity or responsiveness within what's openly talked about to these experiences. I think it's more like, oh yeah, of course you are. You know, like oh yeah, another one.
Yeah.
But to actually be able to share that experience or to reach out in that experience and to feel what other people are feeling and be impacted by that. Because ultimately we are very impacted by those around us who are struggling.
Yeah.
And to see that's where we need to be, is that where we're hurting from other people's suffering is actually needs to be included, right? That
in our own healing.
In our own healing, in a societal healing, rather than this kind of, you know, do good work.
Yeah, it's the bodhisattva vow. So what that means to really feel someone else's pain. As part of your own, not just as part of your own, but then as part of your own activity, and that you need to respond to it in some way. Yeah,
and interestingly enough, that attitude also seems to be the cure for the suffering of, you know, that we experience ourselves and our pain and our trauma. You know. When we're engaged, when our activities are somehow engaged in something larger than just healing ourselves, then we seem to be more uplifted and more available and seem to heal.
Thank you. Yeah, that was really, really good.